Well, Dennis and James have done a good job of having contented life there in the kingdom. And now I've got the mess to clean up because things are on a downward spiral there as we begin to look at things in 1 Kings, the 12th chapter, where we go from kingdom to kingdoms. And we're going to trace two nations in a downward spiritual decline. How do you make a decision? Well, some people would just procrastinate, feel like that's making a decision. Someone else will ask questions. We'll say, well, do I need to ask a little bit more? Define it a little bit more. What's there to understand? What are the risks? What are the values? Others will just flip a coin. Heads, this is what we do. Tails, that's what we do. Others will simply say, go with your gut. And my gut would say, if it's got chocolate in it, that's the decision. Others will say, check your horoscope. See what the stars have aligned that are trying to tell you. Or others use the famous Harvard T, where you state at the top, here's what we need to solve or what we need to do. On one side are the pros. If we take this particular step, here are the reasons we want to go this way. On the other side are the cons. Reasons it may not work, reasons we ought to stay out of there, reasons we shouldn't do anything about that. The others follow your dream. After all, if Elvis can make a beautiful, lasting money out of a song called Follow Your Dream, then that ought to be good enough for us. Follow your dream. Or just don't change. Why should we make a decision? Just stick with what we've got. Or let's pray about it. But which prayer? You remember in James, the 4th chapter, in verse 3, he rebukes them for their prayers are really selfish. And therefore, don't go that route. And then there's the other side, where prayer is seen by Jesus there in Matthew, the 26th chapter, in verse 39, where he prays to the Father in Gethsemane, yet not my will, but thine be done. So when you say, I'm going to pray about it, which prayer you're going to go with to make a decision? You got a choice. You got to be careful. Why? Because our decisions affect others. We're not as independent as we think we are. And we have to be concerned that it's just not my decision, but it'll affect my family, affect the church, affect my neighbors, things like that. So it's being careful about decisions. Now, a new king comes in. Solomon has been the king for a number of years, and he dies. And Rehoboam is going to be the new king. So, as 1 Kings 11, verse 26 says, God raises up Jeroboam before Solomon dies. Why? Because there's some concern by God. Solomon has gotten off course. What started out a man who just was asking for wisdom and was entrusted with the sense of, this is so great, I cannot do it on my own. God has moved out of the picture in Solomon's life. So even in chapter 11, verse 26, from Zerdah, and his mother was a widow named Zerahah. Interesting. We usually feel like the best thing to do is just discount a critic. But we may be missing out on something that somebody's trying to tell us that we wouldn't pay attention unless we'd had a critic. And so, God supplies a critic to Solomon. Does he get the message? No. It's obvious that he does not get the message. Why? Verse 33. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonites, and Shemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. When you see the term Molech, the god of the Ammonites, I can remember visiting there in the Bible lands in Baalbek and seeing someone say, this is it. This is what Molech looked like. A stone statue with arms just slightly bent. And in front of that was a large pit, as long as this row and about 4 lengths wide. You know what that pit was? Folks who were worshiping Molech brought their children and laid them on the arms, and so with the hands just slightly down, the child would roll down into the fire, and they would salute themselves as we did what? We worship Molech. And it was sad. It was sad to believe that's what people followed and did. And Solomon, with all of his wives and concubines, fell into that trap of worshiping Molech. Put us on the third slide up there. Now, there's something else in this formula. And if you look at verse 38 in chapter 11, where God says, if you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. There's the if clause. Simple thing. If you want to be great, Solomon, just obey my commands. Just obey my commands. But he got off track. It is humbling, frightful to see all the wives and concubines and the palaces and the building that he does for their gods all through the land. And he's supposed to be a wise man. But he lost his central operating principle. That is, obey the commands of God. And none of that other stuff needs to come into flow that's there. And so after Solomon dies, here is Rehoboam, who comes to serve as king. Our next slide. In chapter 12, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. Now, that would ring a little bell for us if we paid attention to some characters ahead of that. Shechem has got a history with Abraham, with Jacob, and with Joshua. Kind of a quiet place that they each had stopped and made some history that's there. And so Rehoboam remembers that history of these three outstanding Bible characters. And so that's where he goes, by kind of what you would call his inauguration, to begin to serve as king after his father Solomon had died. So what happened? If you look at chapter 4 of 1 Kings and verse 20, everybody is happy. Everybody is happy. And realize what all has gone on previously up to this point. In 1 Kings 9:19, Solomon had built whatever he desired to be built in the kingdom. If you look at Ecclesiastes, the 2nd chapter, he takes and recounts all that he built. And if you put those together, you realize he made Israel beautiful. He made it admirable. He made it distinctive. Solomon did that. Now, he had well protected. He had his places fortified all through the region. It was a time of peace. But decay is beginning to happen within the kingdom. So despite all the beauty, despite all the fortifications, spiritual decay is happening within the kingdom. And it comes from the highest office. And so one of the prayers earlier today in our worship had prayed for our leaders in our country. It needs to be a constant in our prayer. They may keep godly values in their hearts and minds and words and actions. Very, very, very important for us that's there. But if you go back to 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, and verse 10, Samuel could be able to say, I told you so. But he's dead. Notice what he told the people when they had been asking for a king. And he says, Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some will assign to be commanders of thousands, commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvests, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Continuing in verse 13. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will give the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your men servants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become your slaves. And when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. The prophet Samuel has spoken. The king takes and takes and takes and takes. And Solomon did that. He took and took and took. So no wonder people could come and marvel from foreign lands and see what he had done. But at what price? And did anybody ever stop to assess the price? Did anybody ever stop and say, wait a minute, that's enough? But did you also process and decide, wait a minute, what is this going to cost us spiritually? And so, when Rehoboam becomes king, he'd not checked up on what Samuel's prophecy was there in 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter. Now, At one time, Jeroboam had become quite a critic of Solomon, and he feared for his life, so he went down to Egypt for safety. And now he's going to come back home. Now, one of the questions that I could not get an answer to this, so that's your homework. Figure it out. It amazes me that the children of Israel came out of Egypt. You know, Pharaoh chasing them with his chariots. And yet, when Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus fled, where did they go? Down to Egypt. And when Jeroboam is concerned about whether he's going to live or die, he heads down to Egypt. And part of me says, why did you go north? Or maybe it was just the terrain, the geography would say, go south. You know, admittedly, years have passed and everything, but just one of those questions you wonder about. But Jeroboam reappears, comes back from Egypt, and he still has that rebellious spirit. And so there's a simple request that comes from the people when they state there in chapter 12, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. And Rehoboam says, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. 3 days. There's a lot of things you can think about in 3 days, even as you go to sleep. And you think, well, what kind of perspective do I need to give on answering this question? What do I need to do? His first wisdom step is he takes and consults the older men that have served his dad. And they say, it's time to lighten the load. If today you'll be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. Well, then he rejects their advice and he goes to fellows that are his own age. What do you think we ought to do? Should we lighten the load your father put on us? The young men who've grown up with him in verse 10, well, they'd grown up before verse 10. Tell the people who said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make your yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, and I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, and I will scourge you with scorpions. And then the people return after the 3 days. Rehoboam, what you going to do? And so he tells them. He tells them. In verse 16 of chapter 12, when all the Israel saw the king refused to listen to them, they answered, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel, look after your own house, O David. And so they went home. And then they call on Jeroboam, we need a king over our people. And so Rehoboam is really left with one major tribe, the tribe of Judah and the town of Jerusalem. So the 10 tribes to the north become loyal to Jeroboam. So what has been one kingdom has now become two. Well, the king figured life is just going to go on as I predicted. It's going to be this way. And so he sends out the fellow who is in charge of forced labor, there in verse 18, and they stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escaped to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion. And so what is the best thing to do if somebody rebels against your sin? Get your troops together, all 180,000, and go out there with their chariots, conquer them. But there's a prophecy by God through his servant Shemaiah, verse 24. You are to refrain from going to war against your brothers. So 180,000 soldiers never went to war against their brothers. And so Rehoboam becomes king over Jerusalem south. Jeroboam becomes king over the 10 tribes to the north of Jerusalem. And yet the interesting thing is, both kings will lead their people in going the wrong path. Changes may be small, but to God it represents deliberate disobedience to his will. Now Jeroboam, in order to maintain control and to help people understand he's helping them out, decides, we can't have people crossing over the border to going to Jerusalem to worship. We need our own places. And so he sets up new worship centers for those 10 tribes. And one of them will be in there in Bethel. Bethel's only 12 miles from Jerusalem, but you're not having to go to Jerusalem. And then there's another far north town called Dan that he sets up as the next worship site. Sounds pretty convenient. After all, some people's chief operating principle is it's got to be convenient if I want to do it or else I don't do it. Well, not only does he set up these two sites as places to worship, then he comes in, we're going to put in the golden calves that are there and be able to say, these are what brought you out of Egypt and your safety. And again, why don't people realize, wait a minute, this isn't the way that it is. This is not the decision that we want. Do we want to rebel against forced labor like Solomon did and Rehoboam proposes? Of course. But are we trying to promote a new worship there with these golden calves on the hills of Dan and Bethel? And it ought to be a clue when Jeroboam dismisses the Levitical priesthood and establishes new priests for these places. People's conscience ought to go off and say, wait a minute. The prescribed priests are only to come from the Levitical tribe. And these aren't. These aren't. It's there. I like what Dr. Kurt Brothers said. If God is not on your mind, then God will not be in your decisions. If God is not on your mind, then God won't be in your decisions. And it's obvious from what Rehoboam and Jeroboam are doing, God is not on their mind. And you're seeing a kingdom more than divided, really divided from God. That's there. Now you begin to ask some questions. We've got idols. And what's an idol? Well, an idol was that thing that you look at and you believe that will bring you success. And after all, people like something that is successful. And so they give their affections and they give their time because they feel like that which is going to bring them success needs to get our attention, our money, our interest, and everything. And yet, it's the major prophets that will say, did that idol that's made out of stone or out of metal, did it ever do anything for you? No. Who made it? Man. So that ought to be a clue to you. What? It's no better than man. And we know how fickle and wrong man can get. So an idol is anything that steals away the affections and time that God deserves. And use that as one way to measure your life. If something is stealing away my time and affections away from God, that says something to me that I'm on the wrong path. You remember several months ago that Keith did a series on Wednesday night with an unusual study, but a very helpful study, that really it was talking about how self has become so prominent. And really you'll understand a lot of things in society when you see how people put them as the center, that self is what we've got to watch after. Self is what we've got to be concerned with. Self makes the decisions. And yet if you know anything about your own frailties, you'll know that self is not the best route to go. Let's go to the next slide. All of this to say is, why do we study history? Why do we need to pay attention to this that's found there in the Old Testament? I would say, first of all, notice that the Bible is willing to tell the truth about the people. It doesn't hem, it doesn't haw. It tells the truth about the good and the bad, about people. It'll let us know that Solomon, who started out so strong, and here's a fellow who is so rich that he has 12,000 horses spread among his kingdom. It was described in verse 27, his silver was as common as stones. And yet, the Bible says he didn't pay attention to the if. He was going down the wrong path. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11, there's a verse that we need to hold on to, very much so. These things happened to them as examples or were written down as a warning for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. It gives us a chance to be able to look back and say, I noticed the mistakes they make. There's no point in me going down the same path. They went the wrong path at one point, and I don't need to do that same thing. Can I learn that way? Can I pay attention to see what their fault was? And can I see God's reaction to all of that? And then, even with Solomon's own writings, there in Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, verse 13, after he's looked at so many things that were vanity upon vanity, and had talked about all that he'd done, he said the final thing is to fear God and keep his commands. And somebody should have rushed over and said, Solomon, see what you wrote? Fear God and keep his commands. Pay attention to what you wrote. You did it right then. Pay attention. Get back on track. Fear God and keep his commands. Pretty simple, but pretty great in being able to follow. That's that way. And then, next slide. I like the way William Law finishes it off. We must alter our lives in order to alter our hearts, for it is impossible to live one way and pray another. If our lives are not in line with God's will, our prayers are not going to be right. So the best way to improve our prayer life is to put our lives in line with God's will and follow it in that way. Okay. Next week, we will pause in this study, and Dr. Joshua? Not Ketchup, but Kesem will be teaching this class, and we look forward to learning from him. Let me give you a couple of insights on Freed-Hardeman University. I've had 3 grandchildren graduate from there. They have the best retention rate among students. The best retention rate. That means students who come back semester after semester until they graduate. The other thing they excel in is the large percentage of their students who are out active in the local congregation and doing the Lord's work there. That's without equal. But if Freed-Hardeman trustees had heard what Keith confessed last Sunday night, they'd say, what kind of guy is this that takes golf clubs on his honeymoon? I mean, all week I thought, golf clubs on his honeymoon? The only way I could understand it is 2 things. Lindsay must have loved him, and number 2, he was from northern Arkansas. All right, if you want to read ahead, we're going to next go into Ahab. Ahab will be our next study. Thank you for your attention today.